I'd like to welcome everyone to our Kentucky term limits panel discussion among two of our pledge signers here in Kentucky. Just a little background on the initiative that we're talking about today, and we actually have had someone stop in asking how are we going to get term limits on Congress. That seems like it's impossible, and indeed it does seem that way. Little background about U.S. term limits. We're a national non-for-profit organization that supports a resolution in the state legislatures in order to term limit Congress. If we're going to back up the story just right to the beginning, U.S. term limits was founded back in 1992, way back when I was about 10 years old. And initially, U.S. term limits was always dedicated to term limits on Congress. That was really the big beast that we're trying to get after, and was successful in working with state legislatures to pass bills in their state legislatures which placed term limits on their own delegations to Congress. So every state would have representation always in D.C., but it was up to the individual states to determine what kind of term limits they wanted. So Kentucky could choose something a little longer, and perhaps West Virginia could choose something a little shorter. It was up to them, a little more local control. And so that's the initial route that happened. 23 states passed some form of term limits for their congressional delegations that was set to kick in. Well, that was contested from Arkansas all the way to the Supreme Court. And in a 1995 case called U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton, the Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision against the U.S. Term Limits case, stating that all of these laws that were passed by the states were invalid because only a constitutional amendment, which applied across the board to any member of Congress, would be sufficient for putting term limits on Congress. Without getting into the weeds of the reasoning on both sides of that, it was a 5-4 decision, very much a split decision, very close. Otherwise, our landscape might look a little bit different today. So there's a couple close calls in the 90s. Of course, in the 90s, the House, passed with a majority a term limits proposal, but of course didn't have the supermajority necessary for constitutional amendment. So fast forward to the modern era of U.S. term limits. Here we are. We are bound by the precedent of the court, and we have to get a constitutional amendment for term limits on Congress. And so what do? Well, we open up the Constitution, take a look at Article 5 of the Constitution, which provides for the two provisions for proposal of an amendment to the Constitution and the shared way of ratifying. So in Article 5 of the Constitution, it states that whenever 2/3 of both chambers of Congress propose an amendment, and then it gets sent to the state legislatures for ratification, or in the case of when 2/3 of the state legislatures pass an application or resolution calling for the states to come together to draft an amendment for term limits on Congress, or any topic whatsoever, they have to agree on a topic. So 2/3 of the states today is 34 states of the 50. In order to bring all 50 states to the table, 34 state legislatures, both chambers, need to pass our resolution in order to convene the states for the term limits convention. So that's where we are. And there's a couple of different trains of thought. We do have a bipartisan amendment proposal in Congress. Senator Ted Cruz is the lead sponsor on that. Amy McGrath, candidate here, has signed a pledge for that as well. So it's very much a bipartisan initiative to term limit Congress. Now, we are not foolish, and we're not under any presupposition that if we are so really nice and ask them enough, that Congress is going to term limit themselves. It's just not going to happen. It would be like, with the 22nd Amendment, we established presidential term limits. If it was such that the president had to sign off on an amendment for term limits on the presidency, no president would have signed that off other than George Washington. It's just not their own self-interest to do so. That's why it was not set up so that a president has to approve that. The Congress did it. Congress had, as a separate body, as a different branch of government, inherently or jealousy of the presidential power. And so they had much more motivation to term limit the presidency, as did the state legislatures when they ratified. Similarly, here we are with Congress. Congress is going to be asked to term limit itself, right? everybody, please stop all the chaos that you're showing us every day on the news. We want you to suspend that and everyone put your halos on, at least 2/3 of you, and let's get this amendment proposal. It's just not going to happen by asking you being nice. So that's why you're not being nice. We go to the state legislatures pursuant to the other half of Article 5 and ask that the state legislatures, as separate bodies, with a little bit of a jealous, separation from Congress, to pass our resolution in order to convene the states for the purpose of coming together in sort of an ad hoc convention to discuss, negotiate, yell at each other, and hammer out a proposal for term limits on Congress. Just one amendment is just one purpose. Okay, let's get together and talk about how we're going to term limit Congress, how many terms should it be, etc. Whatever gets passed out of that meeting, that convention, is sent back to the state legislatures to be ratified either by the state legislatures or by state conventions in such, depending on which mode Congress chooses. So that's where we are. And today I'll introduce our panel of discussants. We have two Kentucky state legislator candidates who are going to speak today, as well as one of our own at U.S. term limits. So firstly, let me introduce Mike Van Winkle. Mike Van Winkle is a candidate for the 89th House District here in Kentucky. He's the owner of Bluegrass Turf and Landscape and was an early and eager pledge signer with us. Called him up on the phone and he said, "Oh heck yes, let's get on with this." And he kept talking. He kept calling me. He's like, "What else can we do with this?" So he's been just an incredible cheerleader for this whole issue and an immense asset. So welcome, Mike. Mike Eves is also running for the state legislature. He's running in the 81st district as a candidate, and he's an attorney here in Richmond, Kentucky. And how long have you been practicing law?
41 years.
41 years.
Long enough.
Well known, well established, all around the state, and looking to serve his state here at Frankfurt. And finally, we have Ken Clark, who is my boss. He is our regional director for the South region with U.S. term limits. This guy has been around the country quite a bit, capital to capital, spent some time in talk radio, and say a couple other things about yourself. You got plenty.
Well, I've been involved in politics for about 30 years, and it's very busy what I do. I travel the country. I run 16 different states, and the biggest blessing that I've been given is that I get to deal with people and the grassroots people on both sides of the aisle. So I'm very, very in tune with how people feel about what's going on, not only in their own state, but in Washington, D.C. And U.S. term limits on Congress is a very bipartisan issue. It's got 82% approval rating nationwide. And that's in about 79% for Democrats, about 81 or 82% for Republicans, and about 84% for independents. So there is no party line when it comes to term limits because everyone, regardless of your party, understands that Washington, D.C. is broken. And term limits will go a very, very long way to fixing that problem. Because as Aaron so eloquently put, Washington, D.C. has no motivation for fixing the problems themselves. So we, the people, will do it.
Yeah, great. Ken, I think what you mentioned there with the polling nationwide, there's a McLaughlin Associates poll back in late 2018 that is the most recent poll that we've seen. And the polls are pretty consistent. It's around 80% of American voters that want term limits on Congress. And you see this just very consistent. And I actually think it's probably gone up a little bit since 2018, just given how contentious everything has grown even from then. Here in Kentucky, I like to very proudly say that Kentuckians are 2 percentage points more commonsensical than the American voter, because it's 84% here in Kentucky rather than 82. And actually it breaks down. It does not matter party lines. 85% of Democrats in Kentucky, it's 82% of Republicans, it's 92% of independents. I mean, it's out of the water. And this is why it's such an urgent issue to get done. This is overwhelmingly the will of the voters in Kentucky to get this done. Now, it's not so overwhelmingly the will of Congress, and that's the problem. So we need to get it done through Frankfurt to DC. So let's get into my first question here. Like I mentioned, 84% of Kentucky voters want term limits on Congress, and this includes members of both major parties. Why do you think this is the case? Mikey, let's start with you.
Well, I think you hit on it. I think there's just a general dissatisfaction.
Mike's gonna sing the blues better.
Sorry, guys.
I'm smart enough to leave mine in the car.
That
won't happen to me.
Let's go on our highlight reel.
I think there's just a general, nationally and statewide, I think there's just a general dissatisfaction about what our political system has become. And I talked about that. I did an interview last night, and I talked a little bit about. I was asked why I'm running, and I concluded that we send the wrong kind of people to Frankfurt in our case. Not political party necessarily, but just the wrong kind of people. When's the last time you saw an ad where somebody didn't want to go fight? Looks like to me we've got fighters enough. I mean, they've gotten good at that. Not very good at anything else. So I think there's just a general dissatisfaction among the public, among the voter, just among people who see the news about the dysfunction. And I think that's why this idea about, maybe there's an answer. Maybe we're not stuck with these same folks who seem so intent on just fighting and not solving problems.
Mike Van Winkle, what do you think?
I think Mike hit on a lot of it, and I think more importantly, the state house, but in addition, Washington D.C. has become so polarized. Okay, they go to their respective corners and stick their tongue out at each other. Okay, I'm more of a moderate. I think that we need to find topics and issues that we can all rally around to stop a lot of hate. And I think term limits, by its very nature, is one of those key initiatives that I think that will bring the left and the right together. And I think that once we have something we can all agree on, we can start building from there. And I think it's a great place to start.
Okay.
Well, the people, as I mentioned before, I had the opportunity to talk to people like us. I mean, just people like these guys. These are citizens that are seeing something that they maybe have an opportunity to go fix. But more importantly, people that aren't running for office. And the 82% approval rating comes from people looking at Washington, D.C. and understanding one fact, and that is that it's broken. And the people that are there are the people that have broken it. So they look around at all this infighting in Washington, D.C., and make no mistake, when you get inside the Beltway, the dirty little secret is there's no such thing as Republican, there's no such thing as Democrat. That is an illusion. So that the Democrats claim everything is a Republican's fault. The Republicans claim everything is a Democrat's fault. Why? So that they can constantly continue to get the base, which is the people of the United States, to pick a side. That's where they derive their power. That's where their money comes from. But the dirty little secret, as I had alluded to before, inside Washington, D.C., the only color that matters is the color green, the color of money. And as long as the people believe that one side's going to fix, the other side's going to fix this side or that side, that's where their power base comes from. So they want to attack each other so that you believe it's the other guy and you're going to send money to him. This guy wants you to believe it's him, so he's going to go fix him and you're going to send money to them. And it's all an illusion. But we know that Washington, D.C. is broken. And one of the ways you can fix that is to limit those guys' terms and get more citizens going to D.C. The American public gets that.
Excellent. Ken, you bring up an interesting point that really this comes down to it's not about red, it's not about blue, it's not about purple states, it's about green. and then we're all sold out down the street. And I like to say, I've been hammering this a bunch with people I talk with. Our neighbor is not our enemy. Our neighbors are not our enemy. Unless we have a personal little to quit for them or something. But that's not the case, right? Generally speaking, we're kind of being trained and conditioned into thinking that we go out to war with anyone that has an R next to their name or a D next to their name, right? And so, it's misleading us, and who profits from that? The D's and R's in Congress, right? Working together. So I like to say that they're bipartisan in all of the wrong ways, and partisan in all of the wrong ways. So with this aspect of money, there's another reform that comes up that also has a lot of bipartisan support out there that often comes up in these discussions about term limits. And that reform is campaign finance reform. It has a lot of overlap and bipartisan support. The Republicans and Democrats that have brought this issue up many times over the years. What impact would you suppose term limits might have on campaign finance issues? You like to jump in on that? Sure, Mike.
I think the first thing when you talk about PAC money, okay, to me, I look at it as if the PAC's looking at a candidate as a product, okay, and once they have decided this is the product that they are wanting to back or support or promote, then that unevenly levels the playing field, okay, because once you have a person in Congress for so long, it becomes almost impossible to get them out. I mean, I've looked at the data, and it's alarming because, how many people of color, how many women, how many first-time candidates, when they literally filed to run, just basically had no chance, zero chance of winning. We in Kentucky have a very unpopular senator. He's been in Congress, I think I was 9 years old when he was first elected. So I really don't remember anybody but Mitch McConnell. But, he's not the only one. I mean, there are other people from other states, and I remember Senator Byrd from West Virginia. How long did he have for? The problem is those people are career politicians. And I think we need to change that focus from career politician back to citizen legislator. And I have self-imposed 2 terms on myself. And it's not because I don't want to represent the district, it's because that I think that after a certain amount of time, and having that power for that amount of time, it begins to affect your judgment and how you look at the system, okay? Because at that point, you want to change from changing the system to sustaining that system, okay? And I think that's where U.S. term limits is going to be effective in changing the political landscape.
And I would just add, and I think Mike's right, I would say simply that longevity seems to promote longevity, and it promotes, we have an unusual situation in Kentucky. We have a Democratic candidate for the Senate who has amassed a considerable campaign war chest, but the typical situation is a candidate who's been in office for decades builds up such a line of both financial support and other support that they it becomes uncontestable. I mean, that person becomes bulletproof simply as a result of their longevity. So I think term limits decreases the effect of money on that particular candidate because we all know that clock is going to run out.
The amount of money that it takes for a challenger to go up against an incumbent in Congress is extreme. A typical race is anywhere from $1.2 to $2.2 million just to create the name recognition to become competitive against an incumbent. That's just to open the door. That is not about how much money it takes to win. That's just to get your name recognition up there. Then an incumbent politician has so many advantages that it's hard to list them all. They can get on television, they can get press anytime they want just by picking up the phone. They have the ability to send out campaign-style mailers to their district unlimited amount of times and it's paid for by the US taxpayer. So they get all these benefits of being an incumbent. If they're an incumbent and they're towing the party line, it doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat, and they're in trouble, you can bet Mitch McConnell or Nancy Pelosi are going to be funneling a boatload of money into that incumbent's campaign to make sure that they win. And they can flood the market with any kind of propaganda they want to. A challenger does not have the ability to do that. Very few special interests are going to get involved with a challenger. But the incumbent, doesn't matter again about party, already has those special interests lined up. If it's a Republican, they've got certain special interests. If it's a Democrat, they've got certain special interests. And if that candidate's in trouble, the money starts flowing in, making it next to impossible to oust an incumbent. So when you talk about campaign finance, that has to come from Congress. Does Congress, you think they're going to do anything to limit their own ability to spend? You think they're going to do anything to limit their own ability to have a decisive advantage in a campaign? Of course not. 94% is the re-election rate for Congress. What is it, 13% is the approval rating?
On good days.
On a good day?
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be, right now, it could be as low as 8%. But the current breed of congressman and senator in Washington, D.C. will never, and I mean never, do anything to fight campaign finance. Term limits will bring in a new breed of politician, of citizen legislature, if you will, that will have the guts to take this on. And also, term limits, because we have an 82% national rating, or approval rating, it will prove the power of Article 5. So the people will be able to implement campaign finance as a substitute for Congress. So we can do it. There are a whole host of things that can happen once we know that we can do it ourselves.
Great. I believe that Pat Quinn, the former governor of Illinois, just recently in the last month, had a great short article in The Hill making the case that actually term limits not only might bring about the more likelihood of a term limited legislature enacting campaign finance reform bills, but in and of itself, term limits will actually, in effect, check against campaign finance issues. It points to the fact that special interest PACs give 9 out of every $10 they donate to incumbents over challengers. What does that tell you? Does that mean that the incumbents in Washington are that much better than all the challengers are out there? Or is it really the case that, well, it's much easier to invest long-term in a guy that's already seated with all those advantages than the challenger? So term limits themselves, if you're kicking them out and they're coming out periodically, well, that frustrates that whole situation, and we're going to have to keep actually looking at challenges more seriously. So we're bringing up, that the people really overwhelmingly want term limits. If I go out with a t-shirt hat, a t-shirt, saying I want term limits on Congress, or a hat, right? I make 20 friends, probably make more friends than I made all in high school, right? Just by going, gas up at the pump. And everyone's like, where do you get one of those? And I like to actually grab them out of my car. Here you go. Because I'll make some friends too, right? And it's enormously popular. So that's a foregone conclusion. So what about this though? So we get term limits on Congress. Here's something to consider though. The staffers, the lobbyists, the bureaucrats, they're all without term limits, right? So what about them? Are they going to then just kind of run the show there? This is something that is said, quite a bit by those that we talk to who are opposed to term limits. How do we know that term limits on Congress won't lead to these other entities running the show and bossing the freshmen around?
Well, I think, Aaron, there are two thought processes on it. I choose to believe that if we bring term limits about, okay, the people that are being, that will be seated will have a sense of urgency inherently to get their agenda through and understand that they're not going to be there for 30 years or 40 years or 50 years. So I think that special interests will actually play a lot smaller role in legislation and actually bring the power back to the people, because if you know going in, you're gonna have 8 years or, 6 or 12 years to get something done and you have to move on, I think that they're more inclined to do the right thing instead of waiting around and holding back legislation that would actually help the people.
It seems to me if you believe that term limits on Congress has the effects that we're talking about, it would seem you'd have to also believe that a change in the members of Congress and their terms and longevity would change the rest of the system. May not do it overnight, but again, that new blood, those new ideas, those new faces over that period of time would have to change the whole system, or you're really not accomplishing anything. It sort of points to the fallacy of the whole idea of term limits if that second step is not true. So I think by its nature, when you start changing the makeup of Congress, everything that goes along with it, at least in the medium term, will also change.
I've always found it interesting that they talk about the staffers will run it. Every new member of Congress, every member of Congress has the ability to choose his own staff. And you get a whole slew of freshmen in there, and when you have, a lot of it is dictated by leadership. They will tell you who your staffers are going to be. Once you have term limits, leadership's going to be based on merit. It's not going to be based on who's been there the longest. And let's face it, in order to get into leadership in Congress, it's about how much money you can raise. That's what matters. It's about how much money you can raise. That's what gets you the chairman of a committeeship. That's what makes you the Speaker of the House or the President of the Senate. It's how much money you can raise. So new people coming into Congress, they're going to be able to choose their own staff. And they always talk about this thing called institutional knowledge. The two go hand in hand. It takes you 2 years to find the bathroom. How many times have we heard that? We've all heard it, right? Well, you get a new bunch of congressmen in there, a new bunch of senators, and they say, well, it takes two years or 4 years to figure out the system. They're going to change the system because that's wrong. And they're going to make it to where it's running efficiently because they know they're only going to be there for 8 or 12 years, whatever, and they've got an agenda that they want to punch through. They're going to change that system to make it a lot easier to function properly. I want to mention lobbyists real quick. I'm a professional lobbyist. I'm paid to be a lobbyist. Lobbyists are categorically opposed to U.S. term limits. They hate us. They spend millions of dollars opposing us everywhere we go. Why? Well, because when they buy a politician, they want that politician to be bought and paid for. They don't want to have to change their Rolodex every few years. And a lobbyist's power is in their relationships, who they know, who they've given campaign contributions to, etc. So when a lobbyist looks at term limits, they're going, oh my God, I can't just buy a politician and then 30 years later have to worry about that seat and have to go buy another one. And I do mean buy, because for the most part, politicians are for sale. So they don't like the idea of having, I mean, it'll cost them a lot more money than it's costing them now. And they're categorically opposed because when you leave Congress, what do you want to do? You want to go become a K Street lobbyist, right? Those jobs, everybody's going to want one. And it's going to be a wash like the sea. A droplet of water won't matter anymore, but it becomes far more expensive. And these guys won't be able to control the politicians anymore. So lobbyists hate term limits. They absolutely hate the idea of term limits.
So you kind of branch into something I wanted to bring up. You touched upon the aspect of institutional knowledge. And anyone who has a business knows that there's something to be said for institutional knowledge. I've been a principal in a school, so I had knowledge of certain things that if I wasn't in work, things kind of fell apart. But they'll actually make a case to such an extent that they'll say we don't need term limits because we'll lose all the institutional knowledge and we'll have a bunch of fresh, dual-eyed people that will come in there and not know what they're doing. How do we respond to that?
Well, I think that I agree with you. I think there is value to institutional knowledge, so you're not reinventing the wheel literally every day. but I don't know that I would believe that the term limits we're talking, if we were talking about limiting every national politician to a 2-year term, I think it'd be a serious problem. But that's not what we're talking about. So I think there's always going to be that the necessary institutional knowledge to allow the Congress to do its job. I think the flip side of that is you don't end up with kind of an ingrained system that is so where attitudes and ideas are literally locked in stone because they've developed over 10, 20, or 30 years. So I think that's a legitimate concern. I don't think the term limits, as I understand it, as I understand what's being proposed, causes that problem.
Well, Mike and I have a similar view, but mine's a little bit more extreme. Okay, I'm a business owner. I have employees, okay? I don't give anybody 2 years to find a bathroom. Now, let's just be honest about it.
You put a label on the door, though.
Absolutely. But what I'm saying is, I can't think of a single profession that it takes 2 years to learn the system. And like you said, that system, if that's what's really going on, it's broken. And when you go to the point where you've got politicians that may be going to Washington initially with the best intentions, okay? But I've watched national politics for years, and I've watched these people change. And I've watched their passion for the job diminish because of the system that they are trying so hard to protect. Now, if you look at our current Senator, Mitch McConnell, I remember, and I watched some, I can't remember who put it, maybe it was you or somebody else, that talked about Mitch McConnell's stances when he was running back in the early 90s, late 80s, something like that.
He was in office since '85.
Yeah,
but
so
in '95, he proposed an amendment for the repeal of the 22nd Amendment for presidential term limits. So he is true blue against term limits.
Right, but I remember initially he was for, what was it, healthcare, he was for this, he was for that. And if you look at the candidate Mitch McConnell in the beginning to Mitch McConnell 36 years later, it's Jekyll and Hyde. And I'm not just picking on Mitch McConnell. There are other senators, House of Representative members have done exactly the same thing. And I'm not sure that those people had bad intentions when they got there, but the system twisted and perverted their value system to where they are now beholden to a system, not the constituents. And that is my biggest concern. That's the reason why I'm so passionate about getting this legislation to the House.
I wanted to expand on what you had just said, because people don't necessarily understand how or why that is the case. Let's say you are a freshman congressman or senator, it doesn't matter. Both chambers operate the same way. And you, like McConnell did way back when, and a whole host of others, and this is not party specific, this is the way it works in Washington, D.C. You show up on your first day and you're bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and you've got all these things that you want to try to fix, and these agenda items that you want to try to push forward. And you're an idealist, whichever kind of, whether it's the environment or tax reform, doesn't matter, you're an idealist. And so you get there and you're inaugurated and you're assigned your seat and all that. And then you know by looking at it, and let's say you come from the state legislature, so you've got a fundamental understanding of how legislation works. You want to go and become a member of a committee. And then you've got a bill that you've already written that you want to drop in the House of Representatives. And you want it to go to whatever committee. And so you throw your hat in for that committee. The chairman of that committee and or the Speaker of the House or the President of the Senate is going to look at you and say, okay, here's my agenda. You will vote my agenda or you will not get a seat on that committee. And let's say that agenda violates a lot of your personal principles. It goes against the things you want to do. But you know good and well you can do nothing, not even get a bill dropped, unless you're part of that committee, unless you are doing this. So the moment you want anything, whether it's a seat on a committee, whether it's to float a bill, drop a bill, whether it's whatever the case may be,
If you want something, they own you, because nothing is for free in Washington, D.C. So that's how a freshman principal member of Congress goes from fighting for their principles to becoming part of that cabal. Because the first time you sacrifice your principles to get on that committee, the second time it becomes easier. The third time it becomes easier. The fourth time it becomes easier. 8 years, 10 years, 15 years later, you don't even recognize who that candidate was when they ran for office. And this happens to good people. It's very few that can hold off against something like that. But you notice those few that do don't actually get anything done. They're just noisy.
Ken, I'm gonna keep going with you here. Ken is an Article 5 expert, extremely well versed in the process of Article 5 and the two ways that we can propose amendments to the Constitution. Kind of went into that a little bit at the beginning here. But so let me pose this to you. When we hear this, concerns come sort of from a few fringe groups on both the right and the left. Whereas, the bulk of the people actually support this, and actually that bears out in our polling in Kentucky as well, that the support for this resolution to get this done is at 83%. So the voters actually, I think, know better than these groups. But obviously, I got some bias, right? Ken, why should we then use the state's convention route? Why don't we go the old-fashioned way that we know from Schoolhouse Rocks? Send a bill, on Capitol Hill through the hoops and get it proposed that way. Why don't we have Congress do it? Well, how do we know that this is a safe process to get the states together to propose an amendment for Germany?
Well, that's a very loaded question, and as you had mentioned before, I used to do radio, so I could probably blather on about this for over an hour or 2 or 8, so I won't do that, but let me just address it this way. First of all, we know Congress isn't going to do it, right? We know good and well Congress is not going to do anything to limit their own terms and their own power. So our framers were brilliant men. They gave the states, it was the states that created the federal government. Right? It was the states that wrote the federal constitution. It was the states that ratified it by unanimous consent. So they gave us a way to circumvent Congress, and that is Article 5 of the Constitution. So we're talking about the second way to, quote unquote, propose an amendment. All the power that they have is to make a proposal. That's it. That convention can do nothing more than make a proposal. The states then have to ratify it. It takes 38 states to ratify any proposal that would come out. Just the same is true if Congress were to make an amendment proposal. It takes 38 states to ratify that proposal. Okay, now, does anybody know how many different amendment proposals have been made by individual members of Congress? Take a step. Anybody?
Well, not very good in my opinion.
Try 12,400.
Wow.
Of those 12,400, only 33 have met the threshold of 3/4. Okay. Now, how many different Article 5 proposals have the states actually made on any given subject? Anybody? Over 400. The states have passed over 400 different Article 5 resolutions. Now, why has there never been a convention for the purpose of proposing amendments? It's very simple. Of those 400, we've never had 34 of the same subject. Of the same subject. That is key. These will be addressed singly. I always struggle with that word. Individually. The subjects will be individual. So if we get 34 states that pass a resolution calling for term limits on Congress, you will hear our opposition make the statement that once they get to convention, they can do whatever they want. The First Amendment's on the table, Second Amendment's on the table, the 13th and 14th Amendments are on the table, all this. That is categorically false. It is a lie. It is a bald-faced lie. You've got 34 states saying, we want term limits on Congress. All 50 states are going to send delegates, right? Now, you have to believe that those 34 states that pass that resolution are going to sit down while somebody throws up an amendment attacking the First Amendment. A proposal attacking the First Amendment. You got to believe that the other 34 states are just going to sit there with their hands tied. You got to believe that if somebody throws up an amendment proposal talking about the Second Amendment, that those 34 states are going to sit on their hands. You got to believe that a commissioner who is there at the authority of the state, who is given written instructions to talk about term limits and what those terms will be, if that individual violates that commission, that state is not going to hold them accountable. In Tennessee, if a commissioner were to do that, it's a felony. They can be put in jail. You got to believe that all of those things that are incomprehensible would have to fall into place so that this process would not be safe. I mean, it just cannot happen.
And why would the states ratify an amendment they didn't authorize to propose?
Very good.
It comes down to that. It's like, when you really look at it, like, on a practical level, you don't have to wax philosophical even. Just looking at practically, how would this play out? There's too many parties involved, watching this whole thing. It's vetted. Like, it's over-vetted almost.
Well, and let's talk about these two gentlemen that are
Yeah.
sitting here as well. You win your races, and you're members of the Kentucky delegation, and we pass our resolution for term limits on Congress. You guys will have the authority to choose who those delegates are going to be. There's a very good possibility either or both of you might be delegates to that convention. But the state itself is going to give you their authority. They're going to they're going to loan you their authority to go to that convention. They're also going to tell you what you can approve and what you can't approve. Now, if either of you violate that, let's say you guys choose on Aaron to be your delegate. Let's say he goes outside of that. Are you going to sit on your hands and let him get away with that when he represents you? No. What are you going to do about it, right? Or you're going to recall that person, right?
I'll fetch you coffee. I'd be happy to do that.
Aaron knows me well enough, I would probably come and visit him. The
point being is you're going to recall him.
Right.
And then you're going to send somebody else up there and you'll probably prosecute him. It'd be the same as if you hire an insurance agent for auto insurance. And the next thing you know, you've got a whole life policy, you've got a new homeowner's insurance policy and all that. Are you liable for that? Of course not. That guy violated his agency with you. Same is true for those commissioners.
And I think actually it's more like hiring Mike to represent you. He's got to do what is in your best interest and what would be in the best interest. So talk about term limits.
And typically, you would think that once you've appointed somebody to act as your agent, that their authority is limited to your appointment. Never thought about this conversation about all this being a possibility, but it's sure fertile grounds for sowing doubt and mistrust, I guess, in the whole process. So I'm sure that's why you bring it up. But I can't imagine at the end of the day that that's really a problem.
Well, it's not. And the opposition groups that they'll throw terms at you like Constitutional Convention. It's not. And comparing it to a constitutional convention is like comparing a tricycle to a semi-tractor trailer because they both have rubber wheels. I mean, they're very different things. Article 5 is very clear. It says we are proposing amendments to this Constitution. This Constitution. It operates under the authority of the Constitution. If you wanted to rewrite it, if you wanted to throw out the Constitution and start all over again, states can do that anytime. But they would not invoke Article 5 in order to do that. The reason you invoke Article 5 is to limit what can and cannot be discussed at the amendments proposing convention. It would be like, I don't know if Kentucky is a single subject state or not, but it would be like you having let's talk about this resolution. You've got this resolution going through your committee. And one of the members decides he wants to put a library funding bill as an amendment to this resolution. It would categorically be gavelled down because it doesn't match, it doesn't fit, it doesn't aggregate. It's not germane. There you go. That's the word I was looking for. I couldn't find germane. But it's not germane, and that individual will be laughed at. Same is true with this.
So I have a sort of a closing question for our candidates here. So I think we all agree, congressional terms are not a catch-all. They're not a silver bullet, put term limits on Congress. Congress is not gonna all of a sudden bring in a golden age or something. But it will be a significant reform from what we have now, and set things in motion, give us an opportunity, I think, to get some things done. And sometimes this is like, oh, you think everything will be fixed with term limits? Well, not really. I think people are really just emotionally upset with Congress, right? But it doesn't mean that term limits should be tossed out just simply because, well, I don't understand what the reasoning is, right? If it's a good reform, it's a good reform. Doesn't mean that there aren't other reforms needed. So to that end, what in a realistic sense, what do you think of? Might be a reform that is long overdue, that a term limit in Congress would be more likely to get done than the mess we see today.
Well, I think the one that immediately comes to mind is one that's already been mentioned, and that's the campaign finance. Those decisions, and there are probably lots of others, but that's the one that jumps out at me. I think that decision is much more likely to happen if term limits are adopted. And that's, to me, that becomes a much easier conversation if we don't have people vested in longevity.
I would have to agree with Mike on that. And in addition to that, I think with term limits, I think it creates that sense of urgency, and it really takes that special interest influence out of the equation, because there's not going to be an overwhelming, okay, you're going to be here after 25 or 30 years, so you need to be quiet and just learn how to play the game. There's not going to be time to learn how to play the game. You've got to go and you've got to be productive. Basically from day one, you don't have that 2, 4, 6 year runway to figure it out. I think that by that, inherently, I think that the people that will be representing us in Washington, D.C. will be more inherent to get something done for the people. Because right now, and I can remember at least the last 12 years, Congress has basically done zero to help anybody in any state that I've seen. I mean, it's just like one side wants this, one side wants the other. And it's a show for the people, hey, we're fighting for our way of life, when the reality is nothing's getting done. And it's just a money show.
What do you think would be, what might get more done?
Well, there are a couple different things. I think campaign finance is a major issue. I think also spending is a major issue, because you get in Washington, D.C., for instance, there is so much redundancy. I can't remember which issue it is, but there are 171 different departments in Washington, D.C. that cover one issue. There's 171 different departments that all do the same thing. But let's talk about spending in campaign finance. Congress got together and they decided they were going to fix campaign finance. And you had McCain-Feingold, right? And that bill was written to protect the incumbent. It was, right? Back in the 80s, you had a push to do a balanced budget amendment. And the balanced budget folks got really close. They got to 32 states. And then Congress jumped into action. And you got Graham-Rudman, both bipartisan bills, and both were designed to maintain power in Washington, D.C. Graham-Rudman was supposed to stop the runaway deficits. It didn't do it. McCain Finance was supposed to change campaign finance and make it more transparent and make it easier for others to get involved. It didn't do it. Why? Because both of them were designed to protect Washington, D.C. and the people there. So it's never going to happen there. That's why we have to do it ourselves. The way we do it is through our state legislators. We, the people, could never get a panel with Mitch McConnell in the state of Kentucky. We'd never get him here. There's no way. But we've got these two sitting right here. We can reach out and touch them. We can ask them any question we want. They're right here. They live next door to us. They're ours. They're among us. And these two couldn't be their professions couldn't be more different. Yet they both are running for very similar reasons. And they both want the same things. And that is to fix government.
And one last question. This is just for the candidates, for Mike and Mike. Where is the bathroom? So they already just sheared off 2 years of experience right there.
Well, they had a.
They figured it out.
They had
There's a sign
an
on the
Indian
door.
proof sign right on.
Yep.
So
So
I've got a
you're
question.
already in your second term.
I've got a question. I know this is not what you anticipate, but you can edit this out.
Yes, sir.
Considering everything we've talked about, percentages of people who support this, how do you explain Mitch McConnell in almost 36 years?
Right.
I think 82% of the people favor term limits, and you have somebody who served, I'm old enough, I remember, when he was elected, but how do you
Why is it still there?
how do those, well, no, if 80% of the people say he's been there too long, why is he still there? Right. And apparently maybe they're longer.
Yep, and I think he's a prime example of all we've been talking about, that what it comes down to is the money, the connection, the incumbency advantage is way too strong. That it's practically impossible to unseat a long-term incumbent. Take your pick of anyone that's, our octogenarian caucus, in Congress, and I mean, there are 3 individuals that are 88 years old in Congress, so it's crazy. The incumbency advantage is too much. That means the financial advantage is way too much. The average incumbent spends more in public money through the franking privilege to essentially campaign through publicly financed mailing than their challenger spent in their entire campaign against them. So that in itself, they're essentially publicly funded. I could equal my challenger in spending just with my money through tax dollars. So it's all that corrupting influence. It's all the lobbyists. It's all everything around that we call the swamp. And take your pick, the corrupting influences there are just too strong. And so people get to the ballot box and they go, the same old choices, right? And they don't have feasible challengers in the primary. They don't have opportunities to unseat people because it's hard to be a feasible challenger. I would add this too. There's something, this is a little bit more arcane, but not really. There's a dynamic called the adverse pre-selection. And what this really is that with a non-term limited legislature, you inherently have a longevity-based seniority system in place. That's what it defaults to. The longer you are there, the more clout you have, the more favor you've done for the parties, the more fundraising you've done, the more dollars that you've done day in and day out instead of legislating. Right? The more you're going to be put in a position of power. That takes time. So if I'm a successful person, I have a business, I've been a teacher, I've been a police officer, I've been a fireman, whatever it might be, you're a farmer, whatever, from a variety of different backgrounds. And I don't have that kind of money, but I'm looking at this and saying, okay, let's assume I have a lot of money. I say, okay, I'm going to lay aside my business. I could lay it aside for 8, 10 years and come back. I could, put others in charge and set it in motion. But if I look at it here, if I go and spend 8, 10 years in DC, I'm not getting anything done. I'm not going to get appointed to chairmanships. I'm not going to get preference. So really, what am I going to get done if I don't stay here for 15, 20 years? And I've actually looked back into the history. When did our current leadership, majority and minority leadership, get into their positions? And it was on an average of 12, 15 years before they had their first chairmanship, right? And so you really do have to say, it encourages an attitude of, well, I have to lay aside and create a new career. It encourages careerism right at the outset and attracts careerist-minded people more often. That's not to say every candidate out there is a careerist-minded person. They're not. But it lends itself to that, whereas someone with common sense might say, well, why would I go sacrifice all that just to be kind of laid aside in Congress? So people want choices, and that's why overwhelming people are frustrated at the ballot box. They keep looking and saying, the same choice again. So I just wanted to kind of give you guys an opportunity to have some closing remarks, just to say a few words in closing. Anything that's on your mind? Yeah.
Anything that's on my mind?
Sure,
That's
yeah.
a pretty big, that's a pretty broad.
I like the First Amendment. Go for it. Yeah.
You know, I'm pleased, I didn't, and I think I've expressed this to you before, until you sent me an email one day and called me about this topic, probably early in this year. I didn't know this movement existed. I think it's interesting, and I think that, I agree with you, I think there are a lot more people who would support it if they knew about it, and maybe that's, I guess, the reason for this. I'm not a politician. This is my first, at my age, first time running for office. Then when that comes up, maybe my only time. I guess I'm disappointed that the Republicans are not here, are not in my Republican incumbent. My opponent is not here having this conversation, because I think I agree with you. I think this ought to be a bipartisan effort, and there ought to be bipartisan support. I think this is the third one of these that I've done, and each time my attitude is it's important enough for me to show up. So I'm disappointed she's not here. I think that would lend, again, a sense of bipartisan support to the effort. But you know, it's an interesting, run for office is an interesting thing, and I'll leave you with this. Doesn't really have a lot to do with this, but running for office causes you to stop and think and reflect and admit to yourself what you believe. And you could go through life, and I've probably been through most of my life and never really stopped to think about, but this would be one of many subjects. I had no reason to. Running for public office makes you stop and think about all the things, all the issues that are out there that you never had a cause to have an opinion about, never had a cause to know much about, and you start to think, what is it I really believe? And it's an educational process. It's kind of a self-education process. And that's part of what I've enjoyed about running for office, even in this strange pandemic time that we're in. But I've enjoyed participating in these events. Well, thank you for doing it.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
Well, as Mike said, he was a first-time candidate. I'm a first-time candidate. I've been civically involved for years and years and years. But I have watched, as time goes on, that the system doesn't get less broken. It becomes more broken and more broken and more broken. And I've always told the kids that were in my youth groups, kids I've had affiliation with, do your best. Don't complain if you're not going to try to fix the problem. So, you know, it's kind of one of those man in the mirror moments. You know, I looked at myself and I thought, I'm going to be a Democrat running in a race that is basically an 80% Republican district, a very ruby red district, but I am conservative. And I said to myself, well, I'm going to at least make an attempt at it. And then all the different special interest groups started trying to talk about, hey, you want to talk about this issue, that issue? And I never really was passionate about it. Then you called. You said, hey, Mike, how do you feel about term limits? And I mean, it was just like a light went off. Okay. It's bipartisan. It is something that the people could utilize and need. It needs to happen. Because if we're going to get anything done for the people, we've got to bring the power back to the people. And Congress has absolutely no reason whatsoever to give it back. You know, I've heard the term for years. Some people play to win, some people play for keeps. Well, it seems like Congress in general, Democrat and Republican alike and independent, they're playing for keeps. They got it, and they do not have any intention of giving it back to the people. Well, we are the people. We do have that control. We do have Article 5 that says, wait a minute, you can play that game. We're just going to change the game that's being played, and we're going to take back what is rightfully ours. So like you said, we don't have to be nice about this. So I've talked to a lot of voters, especially in Jackson County and down here in Berea. I haven't talked to one single person that said, well, I don't know about term limits, but it doesn't sound like a bad thing. So even the people that are on shaky ground with the system, I think inherently, if we had an opportunity to push this agenda to the front. You know, when I'm elected, I gave my word to you that this is gonna be one of the very first things that I bring up and we're gonna put on the floor, if I can get it there. So I wanna thank you guys for doing this forum, and the online forum was awesome. And I'm glad that you took time to talk to all the candidates, and it wasn't just a straight Democrat or Republican love fest. It was, these are the people that are citizen legislators, people from every kind of background you can imagine. We've had school teachers, attorneys, small business owners such as myself, and we all care about the system. And the system is, we need a new one. We need to make sure that we streamline government. We need to make sure that it is effectively working for the people. And when I go to Frankfurt, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So thanks for having us here.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
We've never, well, it's been very few times in our country's history that we have been as divided as we are now. We've got all these different factions out there fighting, literally fighting in the streets. Term limits is one of those issues. It is the only issue on the table right now that can bring everyone together. Doesn't matter whether you're independent, Democrat, Republican, Green Party, whatever, Libertarian, it just doesn't matter. It brings everyone together. And it's an issue that we can all agree on. And we do. We all agree on it. That is how things start. You get people in a room like this, and they start talking about issues that they do agree on, and the next thing you know, they're going to be talking about something else that they might agree on. Then they're going to be talking about something else that they might agree on. Then it becomes a matter of tactic. How do you go about getting these things accomplished? But if we can all start with 5 or 6 things that we agree on, we may disagree on how to do it, what's the best way, but that then becomes a strategy conversation. That becomes a strategy about tactics. And usually the best ideas will rise to the top, but you have to start with an issue that can get everybody in the room nodding their heads. Yep, we need to do that. Term limits is that issue. It is the only unifying issue that I can think of right now across the board. And that will bring people of all walks of life to the table, and we can actually start having a dialogue on how we're going to fix things, instead of attacking you and attacking you and attacking you because my T has a curl at the end and yours doesn't. Amen.
All right. I want to thank everybody for coming today. Thank you very much. This is a great forum. And we will premiere this a little later next week on Facebook, on our state Facebook page, KentuckyTermLimits.com, or not .com, Kentucky Term Limits on Facebook, and we'll share that and get it out there. So thank you very much, all three of you. All right.
Thank you. Good to see you.